The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone.
In this parable today, I'm afraid we are not going to find gentle Jesus, meek and mild. We're going to find Jesus provoking conflict and rubbing salt into some very deep wounds. And as we read this parable on St. Francis Day, we may even start to wonder whether this 13th century friar, who was at peace with everybody, may have actually been more Christ-like than Jesus. But I guess it depends what you mean by Christ-like. You see, telling a story in which tenant farmers are the bad guys was not going to make Jesus any friends. The existence of tenant farmers and absentee landlords in Israel at that time was a festering wound. The division of land, way back in the book of Joshua, had ensured that each family had their own patch of land, and the inheritance laws were there to ensure that that family remained on that patch of land and was able to farm that patch of land generation after generation. Every 50 years, in the year of Jubilee, any land that had shifted around was supposed to be given back to the original family. Supposed to be. The connection between family and land had been eroded over the centuries in many ways, and the most recent challenge in the first century, where Jesus finds himself, was the crippling impact of Roman taxes and temple taxes. Many families could not afford these taxes and found themselves sinking further and further into debt until they lost their land. And when their land was bought up by one of a very small group of seriously rich and increasingly rich people, that family that had owned that land for centuries might, if they were fortunate, become tenant farmers on their own land. And then they would be expected to hand over so much of the produce and the income from their property to their landlord that they would often be left with scarcely enough to live on, or not enough to live on. So at the individual level, people were becoming more and more impoverished, more and more desperate. And at the societal level, the connection between ownership of land and the working of land had been broken. People who had no connection to the land were the ones making money out of it. And most of the population were working like slaves to line somebody else's pockets. So, when you read this parable with that background in mind, you might find that your sympathies are with the tenant farmers rather than the landlord. Farmers who have lost their land and are now watching their children starve may well become desperate enough to beat up the messengers that come from some rich absentee landlord they've never met. So this story, which might be quite familiar to some of us, is not really as simple as we may have thought. It would have been profoundly uncomfortable for the original hearers to listen to, which always means that if we're not feeling uncomfortable when we hear it, then we are missing the point. And as Jesus turns from parable to interpretation, he doesn't directly equate the landlord with God. And we need to be careful not to do that either. But we are invited to reflect on the ways in which God is like the landlord and the ways in which God is not. The ways in which God is like the typical landlord of their day, and the ways in which God is not. Do we ever think of God as an absentee landlord? Do we think of God owning the universe and demanding more and more from us than we are able to give, exploiting us and exploiting the land without any compassion for either. There are certainly people who think that the Christian God is just like that. But there are elements in this story that question that view of God. Firstly, there's a really bizarre bit in the story. Slave after slave is sent to the farm to collect the produce, and each of them is beaten up and some of them are murdered. So what does the landlord do? He sends his son. This is a seriously stupid and reckless move that no landlord in any time in history would do, unless the son was armed and backed by a sizable army. And clearly, that wasn't the case in the story. So, this uncomfortable story becomes even more unsettling. What sort of crazy person is this landlord? Crazy because he gives far too much benefit of the doubt. Surely, he says, they'll respect my son. He's crazy because he meets violence with gentleness and unearned trust. He's crazy, like the shepherd who leaves 99 sheep to look for the one that's lost. He's crazy, like the father who gives half of his property so that his good-for-nothing son can abandon all responsibility and abandon him. And then wait desperately for that son to return. Notice that it's Jesus' hearers who assume the landlord's next step will be to show up with the violent force that they know most landlords in their experience would have taken after the first slave was beaten up. But Jesus didn't say that. He leaves the story unfinished. So, we have this unsettling craziness in the story. And there is also a play on a story from their past that the hearers would have been very familiar with. The prophet Isaiah had told a story in which the people of Israel were likened to a vineyard that God had lovingly planted and protected, but that then had produced bad grapes. The people had produced injustice instead of justice. And in that story, the owner tears down the vineyard and uproots the vines as an indication that the people of Israel were to be taken into exile. This story Jesus tells is almost identical to that one, but with a very notable difference. In Jesus' version, the grapes are not the problem. The vines are not the problem. The farmers are the problem. Jesus is saying that the people are not the problem. The leaders are the problem. And because Jesus is not being terribly subtle here, these leaders see right away that Jesus is holding a blowtorch to their bellies. And so, of course, they want to arrest him and get rid of him, but they don't, because just like last week, they were afraid of the crowds. So you see, Jesus isn't really doing a lot toward making friends here. But in the limited time he has, he's trying to help his followers understand what is about to happen. One thing that is super clear in the way Matthew tells the story is that Jesus does not hold the Jewish people responsible for his death. He holds their leaders responsible. The anti-Semitism that was one of the tragic false steps of the early church that has borne fruit in so much evil throughout history can't be traced to Jesus. The story of the people of Israel was from start to finish a story of failed leadership, a story of leaders rejecting the wisdom of God, rejecting the law of God, rejecting the prophets of God, and ultimately rejecting the Son of God. The story of the human race, despite some glimmers of glory, has also been a story of failed leadership, which should give anyone of good conscience pause before taking on a position of leadership. And that brings us to St. Francis. By all accounts, he was born an incredibly sweet and winning young man. Everybody loved him. But that is not what made him a saint. That is what made him a good salesman. He was helping to grow his family's prosperous cloth business when he was called by God to question everything that he had valued up until that point. He then misappropriated funds from the family business in order to repair a church, which is generally not the thing that's encouraged as a first step towards becoming a saint. As a result, his father disowned him. For him, that expulsion from wealth and privilege was a sort of exodus. It released him from slavery to business obligations and allowed him to live in the freedom of poverty. It released him from slavery to family obligations and allowed him to live in a way that genuinely embraced every creature as a brother or sister. And not just every human creature, but every animal and plant and the earth and the moon and the whole constellation. The last thing he wanted, as far as I can see, was to move from business leadership into church leadership. But when large numbers of people joined him in a life of communal poverty, he did what he could to guide them and give their movement legitimacy within the church systems of his day and to give them a future beyond his death. There is so much more that could be said about him, but here in Brisbane, in the Anglican Church, there are so many Franciscans around. The college is named after St. Francis. So many places and people you can go to find out more about him. This morning, I just want to bring these two things together. We have seen over the past 2 weeks and over the past several millennia that when good people become leaders, they often get entangled in systems that shut down their best intentions and cause them to perpetuate the behaviours they had intended to challenge. Francis chose freedom by removing himself from those systems. He said, "Grant me the treasure of sublime poverty. Permit the distinctive sign of our order to be that it does not possess anything of its own beneath the sun, for the glory of your name, and that it have no other patrimony than begging." Now you are thinking, yes, but, and I am thinking, yes, but as well. It is more complicated than that, but our world is crying out for leaders who are people who respect everyone, but don't cave in to public pressure. People who accurately identify the threats, but don't give in to fear. People who trust God, but don't assume that they have God's seal on everything they choose to do. People who set high ethical and moral standards for themselves and then live by them, even if that means sacrificing their position of leadership. Leaders like that are people who have found freedom from the systems and pressures that constrain everyone else. And freedom is never won without struggle. Francis's path to freedom was radical poverty. Maybe it doesn't have to be quite so radical for everyone, but as long as we go with the flow and do what everyone expects of us, we will never know what tyrants we might be serving, or what servants of God we might be wounding. And we will never know what we might accomplish for God's kingdom if we found a way to live in genuine freedom. So this coming week, may you find freedom by saying no to things that you have been told that you need, and by saying yes to loving fellowship with all creation. Amen.